I'm Beverly, and I'm on the witness stand. Welcome back to the witness stand, everybody. We are recapping week 3 of the Lindsay Clancy murder trial. For the first 2 weeks, the Commonwealth spent a great deal of time proving something that we already knew and something that the defense is not even contesting. Lindsay Clancy killed Cora, Dalton, and Callan, her babies. Killed them all. And this week we got to the real fight. What was happening to Lindsay Clancy mentally in the months and days before January 24th, 23, and did the mental health system recognize it? The striking thing is that the defense hasn't even started its case yet, and Kevin Reddington spent much of days 10 through 13 using prosecution witnesses constructing his own argument. And there is some tension running through nearly every mental health witness. They did not observe psychosis, but they absolutely observed a woman that was not well. That distinction is critical. Once the lack of criminal responsibility is properly raised, the Commonwealth must prove criminal responsibility beyond a reasonable doubt. And that issue centers on whether mental disease or defect deprived her of the substantial capacity to appreciate the wrongfulness of her conduct to law. A lot of that. There was a lot to unpack in that. But let's start with day 10 and return to Dr. Jennifer Tufts. So why does she matter? Well, she may be the most important treating provider witness we've heard. She was Lindsay's principal psychiatrist from September 2022 until January 23rd, 2023, the day before the killings. She was on the stand for over a day and a half, and Reddington spent hours crossing her. Now, what the Commonwealth actually gets from Dr. Tufts is that Lindsay did not tell her that she was hearing voices, that she did not report mania, that she saw no signs of psychosis. Lindsay denied ever having a plan to kill herself, and Lindsay never told Tufts about the thoughts of harming her children. So when told that Lindsay allegedly had disclosed thoughts of harming the children to Patrick, Tufts said, "I would have been very concerned if I had heard that." So this is strong evidence for the Commonwealth. Her treating psychiatrist saw her repeatedly and did not diagnose the postpartum psychosis. Then Reddington turned the telescope around and he focused on this: Tufts' relative lack of independent practice experience when she began treating Lindsay. I had mentioned before she looked like she was a sophomore in college, but she had 4 years of independent practice. So yeah, that's not a lot. And Lindsay was a very difficult case, but she had short telehealth appointments. Her repeated psychiatric medication changes, reports of worsening anxiety, depression, and insomnia. Lindsay saying she felt awful after a Zoloft increase, periods of hopelessness and feeling close to suicidal. Why Lindsay was never required to come in for an in-person psychiatric evaluation, and why there was an escalation to hospital evaluation at the January 23rd appointment. And Tufts also said she had not known that Lindsay had called a suicide hotline. Tufts is important because she gives both sides something powerful. The prosecution says her psychiatrist saw no psychosis. The defense says her psychiatrist documented a deteriorating patient right up through the day before the killings and still didn't recognize what the defense says was happening. So, day 11 of court, we get to Julie Paul and Rebecca Gelada. Now, these are important witnesses. Psychiatric nurse Julie Paul, who specialized in pregnancy and postpartum care, treated Lindsay briefly in November of 2022. Lindsay came to her largely because of concerns about medications being used for sleep, and her medications were again being adjusted. Paul testified that Lindsay never reported hallucinations or thoughts of harming herself or children. Paul matters, but Rebecca Gelada moved the ball considerably further. So Rebecca Gelada was another psychiatric nurse practitioner involved in Lindsay's care. And now we are starting to see deterioration in real time. So Lindsay, as having intrusive thoughts of wanting to die, persistent depression, hopelessness, emotional numbness, serious concern over her medication, efforts to taper benzodiazepines, a period that Lindsay and Patrick described as her worst day yet. A recommendation that Lindsay go to an emergency department and receive a higher level of care. So at one point, Lindsay's sleep improved to 7 to 9 hours of sleep, but she still continued to report depression, hopelessness, and numbness. Now, that was something that we talked about a lot, was that she was really struggling with sleeping, but she did start improving with her sleeping, but the other part didn't decrease. Her numbness to life around her, depression, and hopelessness. And here's where the continuity of care issue appears. Gelada acknowledged that she didn't contact Women and Infants Hospital to find out why Lindsay wasn't admitted to its postpartum program, and did not have Lindsay sign a release so she could obtain information from other providers. Reddington also questioned why she didn't follow up when Patrick planned to take Lindsay to McLean Hospital. What we see here a lot are these providers that have access to the same information, but they don't get it. So Tufts has access to Gelada, who has access to Paul, who has access to on and on, but they don't even stop to look at the other people's records. They don't even stop to ask questions to see the framework. Where are you, Joe, pointing to? What is your diagnosis and what is your recommendation? And Jane over here, what are you doing? Why did you recommend this medication? Nobody's talking to each other. And that's where Reddington really says there's breakthroughs, because nobody is even trying to contact each other. So we're looking at best, fragmented care. Several people were treating Lindsay and nobody was communicating. So did anyone have the whole picture here? I don't think so. Now, day 12, we get Letitia Dukes was Lindsay's therapist at South Shore. This is so hard to say for me because it sounds like they're saying South Shore, but it's South Shore Health Prenatal Clinic. She saw Lindsay 4 times. She said that Lindsay presented with anxiety, significant insomnia, low mood, numbness, frequent passive suicidal ideation, intrusive thoughts of dying, and anxiety that something bad might happen to her children. On December 5th, Lindsay reported contacting crisis services after a particularly bad weekend with intrusive suicidal thoughts. Dukes eventually recommended a higher level of care. Another one, a higher level of care, specifically a postpartum partial hospitalization program at Women and Infants Hospital, because the passive suicidal ideation continued despite crisis intervention. Okay, so no, she didn't have a plan. They all talked about it. Yes, she talked about suicide, but she never had a plan, so they didn't carry it further. But this Letitia Dukes says that in spite of having the passive, meaning that she talked about it, no plan, it was continuing. And no matter what kind of intervention they were doing was not helping. So that is very important. Her own treating therapist believed that outpatient treatment was no longer enough, that she needed to be inpatient. And this is also the second provider that is saying we need a higher level of care, Gelada and Dukes. Now, one of the bombshells that was dropped by Dukes this week was pretty much she was looking for help. So Reddington eventually stripped away all the clinical language, and he said, was Lindsay sincere? Was she hurting? Was she looking for help? Was she essentially turning everywhere she could for help? Duke's answer, correct. Star that one. This is a prosecution witness, a woman who actually treated Lindsay, agreeing with the central theme of the defense. It doesn't prove insanity, it doesn't prove psychosis, but it substantially undermines the suggestion that Lindsay simply wasn't trying to get help. Bombshell number 2 from Dukes. When Dukes recommended women and infants, Lindsay went, but she wasn't admitted. Reporting from the testimony says that the program cited concerns about her prescription regimen. Reddington then asked Dukes whether it would surprise her to learn that, in their view, Lindsay was suffering from over-medication rather than a condition their postpartum program could treat. Dukes said that would surprise her. Dukes bombshell number 3, the improvement. Dukes had a note from December 19th describing Lindsay as more engaged, and she was able to laugh. Well, that sounds really good for the prosecution. However, Reddington read another portion of that same record, and it said Lindsay continued to report low mood and numbness. His point was essentially, how much does a momentary laugh really tell us about a psychiatric improvement? Dukes explained that the clinical notes were summaries, and that the laugh occurred in a particular part of the conversation. So that's a small exchange with a big lesson. And this is Bev's opinion. Someone looking normal for 25 minutes isn't necessarily the same thing as someone being mentally well. I'd like to point out, you probably have seen that commercial, the depression, it's a pharmaceutical commercial for someone who has anxiety, and they hold the fan up to their face, or the little, looks like fan thing, and it's got a smiley face, but behind it they're looking very depressed. Well, that's kind of how I see this whole thing being. Lindsay had a moment where she could laugh and smile and talk about some good things. I think she discussed going to a museum with Patrick and the kids, and that she looked like she was having a good time. That doesn't mean mental illness is gone, that the mental illness has stopped. You're still having issues, you're just not showing it at that moment. You're putting on the face. Maybe it was not even a face. Maybe it's just Lindsay, for a moment, having something that was good. Spending time with her family. So Dukes also helped the prosecution, though, and this matters because Dukes testified that she did not see mania, delusions, paranoia, psychosis, or homicidal ideation. This pattern now repeats from provider to provider. Nobody saw any kind of psychosis or anything like that. And so that's going to be a strong argument for the Commonwealth. Day 12, bombshell, the voices theory. This was interesting. Massachusetts State Police investigator Daniel Lawler. Well, look, we should just stop right here and let him have his own piece of the show. He got up and he testified that police investigators had been discussing a theory that Dr. Paul Zeisel, the psychologist who saw Lindsay in the hospital after the killings. I got to stop there. I got to back up a little bit. When Lindsay was first arrested, now she's in the hospital, but she's still arrested. And she's guarded by police. And the only people that can go in and out of that room is staff, medical staff, and police professionals, okay? Those were the only people that could go in, nobody else. So Reddington had to get a court order that would allow a psychiatrist of their choosing to come in and talk with Lindsay. That psychologist, I'm not sure which one he is, was Dr. Paul Zeisel. And again, court ordered because nobody could get in there. So the state police investigators started discussing a theory in which Dr. Paul Zeisel, the theory was that Zeisel might somehow have prompted Lindsay to later tell Patrick that she had heard voices. This would have obviously been devastating to the defense if there was evidence of it, but there wasn't. Lawler acknowledged he never heard Lindsay's conversation with the Zeisel, which that would have been an issue because, doctor patient. He didn't hear any subsequent call to Patrick. Investigators had discussed the theory, but it wasn't investigated to the point of establishing evidence for it. So Reddington asked whether the Zeisel theory lacked investigative basis, and Lawler agreed there was no investigative basis. The idea that a defense psychologist planted the voices story sounds explosive, but what came out in court was that the investigators had speculated about it without developing any evidence to support it. So it was just created somewhere out of thin air. I can sit around and create all kinds of theories, but that doesn't mean anything. I have to investigate them, and I have to see if there's any evidence to support it. And there wasn't. How this even got brought in is amazing. But if you look around the social media, you look around Reddit, oh my gosh, Reddit. If you look at any of those things, you're going to see that this thing is just ripe for the taking. People have all kinds of theories now, even that Patrick committed the murders. Please. But it did make things a little bit more interesting. But now, I have to say this. The hardest part of the day was the autopsies. Dr. Renee Stonebridge and Dr. Barbara Olson testified about the injuries to Cora and Dawson. And, we'd already had the autopsy information last week, I think it was, or in the first week, of baby Callan. But this time it was of Cora and Dawson, and it was very emotional. And Lindsay, distraught's not the word for it, but she became extremely emotional, just absolutely distraught, and court had to be stopped several times. At one point, she audibly said in the middle of testimony, "I can't do it." So the judge stopped, and everybody took a break. I mean, you can imagine how hard this is to hear. It doesn't matter what you think about what she did, it's still, her testimony is that she didn't understand what she was doing at the time. But, it depends on what school of thought you take. If you are of the mindset of the person that says that she created this, you might want to say she should sit there and listen to that. But it's obvious that it's a very emotionally charged time when she sits and listens to the autopsies. However, they did take a break, and the judge reminded this jury of something that can get lost in all of the psychiatric testimony. 3 very young children died horrific deaths. The defense can explain why, but it can never make that fact less terrible. So on day 13, this was another blockbuster day. The Commonwealth introduced Lindsay's digital life, and it got something useful. On January 20th, 4 days before the murder, there was a search. Can you treat a sociopath? That's 4 days before the killings. That sounds awful for Lindsay. A prosecutor can stand up in closing and ask, who was she thinking about? Herself? Someone else? Why was she searching that? We don't know. But then Reddington cross-examined the phone expert, and suddenly we learned that the phone contained searches that the Commonwealth had not highlighted on direct. Before the murders, Lindsay searched hallucinations on January 13th, on January 20th, psychosis, on December 29th and January 13th, bipolar and postpartum depression, schizophrenia, insomnia, and information about her medications. That's a big deal. Not because Googling psychosis proves psychosis. It absolutely does not. But remember the state police speculation from the day before that perhaps Dr. Zeisel somehow planted the idea of voices after the murders. But the jurors learned that Lindsay was researching hallucinations and psychosis before she ever met Zeisel. So that doesn't prove she heard voices, but it makes the chronology important. The suicide searches and these searches happened before the Zeisel. Okay. A phone forensics witness, and I hope I'm saying his name right, Timothy Chiappini, something like that. Reddington asked about the searches reportedly involving the carotid artery, how to slit one's throat, and disabling an airbag in a Kia Sorento. Chiappini didn't independently remember those searches, although Reddington said that the forensic report contained those searches. The suicide methods search takes a hit. There had been an older search on the family's computer for suicide methods. The prosecutors had made that look really ominous. But on day 13, there was some context to that. So the search occurred while somebody was looking up musician Tom Hall, whose death was a suicide. That computer belonged to Patrick, and the investigator couldn't identify who was actually using it. So searches were on Patrick's computer and many times under Patrick's email or email sign-in. And some of them or searches about suicide were done when Lindsay's had children's medical appointments, so it couldn't have possibly been her. And the expert said that he could say what was searched, but he could not say who was sitting behind the screen making those requests. The Commonwealth cannot attribute those searches to Lindsay. And then we get the phone that humanized her. And this part was just sort of startling after all that darkness. Her phone also contained searches for children's movies, Paw Patrol, and printable unicorn material, baby's food, children's food. And on the morning of January 24th, the day of the murders, Patrick texted Lindsay, "You're a good mama." Later, they discussed takeout because it had been a long day, and this was on the phone. And that's the same takeout trip that the Commonwealth said Lindsay had deliberately engineered to get Patrick out of the house. And this is where the two collide. Prosecution said she researched the restaurant in CBS and created an opportunity for her to be alone with the children and Patrick out of the house. But the defense says, well, it just looks like mundane family life, a tired mother discussing dinner with her husband. Same evidence, but two completely different narratives. Lindsay had written a note, and you have the little note section on your phone, and Lindsay had written a private note in December about Callan and her family. And she said in that note, she worried that stopping breastfeeding had left her feeling disconnected from Callan. She wanted him to experience the same love and attention that Cora and Dawson had received. She was worried that she wasn't parenting any of her children the way she wanted. And she wrote, "I just want to feel happy." She even contemplated eventually having a fourth child, but she said she would first need a really good therapist. She also expressed fear that something might happen to her children. So why does this matter? Well, it wasn't written for a psychiatrist. It wasn't written for Reddington. It wasn't written for the jury. It predates the murders, and it doesn't prove insanity either. But it is contemporaneous evidence of how she was describing her own emotional state privately. It was her inner thoughts that was not really intended for anybody else. She wasn't doing it for anybody. It was a journal entry. And that's potentially much more persuasive than somebody remembering a conversation 4 years later. The Commonwealth's strong counterpunch on day 13 came by way of Trooper Joshua McKelligan. This returned the case back to the physical reality of the murders. One particularly important point concerned the strangulation. He testified that a medical examiner had explained during the grand jury investigation that after someone becomes unconscious from strangulation, additional minutes of sustained strangulation is required for death. Enormously to the prosecution, because they're going to say she didn't perform this in one split-second act. There were 3 children. The Commonwealth can use the duration and repetition to argue deliberation, intent, and purposeful behavior. And then the police missed pill bottles. Reddington also brought out that the pill bottles remained in Lindsay's nightstand after the state police searched her home. He said he found them and he offered to turn them over. Why does that matter? Because the prosecution had drawn conclusions from what medications were found, how many pills remained, and whether Lindsay appeared compliant with the medication. If the evidence collection wasn't complete, then the defense can attack conclusions built from incomplete inventory. It creates another evidentiary question for the defense to exploit. I want to hit 6 points before I leave you. Overall this week, we're talking about the treatment system looks very fragmented. Multiple people were treating Lindsay, but important information was not being shared. Dukes agreed that Lindsay was sincere, hurting, and seeking help. That came from a Commonwealth witness. A higher level of postpartum care was recommended, but Lindsay ultimately wasn't admitted, and questions arose about her medication regimen. What was it that women and infants saw that was being either overlooked, ignored, or just they didn't care by all the other professionals? Police speculation that Zeisel planted the Voices story had no established investigative basis. Before the jury learned that Lindsay had researched hallucinations and psychosis before the killings. Now, my thing is, this should never even have been brought up. Where would this have been brought up? I mean, why would this have been brought up? This is like pulling a story out of the air. Her phone documents both darkness and motherhood. Mental health searches, suicidal related searches, the sociopath search, but there were also children's activities, family life, and a private note describing depression and wanting to be a better mother. And then another was that every major treating provider still said, I didn't see psychosis. That's the Commonwealth's lifeline right there, is they did not see psychosis. And it's a substantial one. So who would I say won week 3? The defense, I think, but with an asterisk. I think Reddington had the better week, and the remarkable part is that he hasn't even called his witnesses yet. He extracted evidence, and I will list, of deterioration, suicidality, insomnia, repeated medication changes, failed or in communication among providers, repeated help seeking, the women and infants issue, pre-murder psychosis hallucination searches, and the weaknesses in the Zeisel planted Voices theory, all largely through the Commonwealth's case. But Commonwealth has not by any means lost this case. Its cleanest argument remains Lindsay was mentally ill, but that does not necessarily mean that she lacked criminal responsibility. Provider after provider said they saw no psychosis. So week 3 made the defense theory much more believable to me. It did not yet prove the defense's legal case. I think the most important question after week 3 isn't, was she mentally ill? The question is whether what these providers labeled anxiety, depression, insomnia, intrusive thoughts, and suicidality were separate symptoms, or were they pieces of a psychiatric illness that they failed to recognize? And even if the defense proves that, it still has one more mountain to climb. proving that her condition on January 24th meets Massachusetts' legal standard for lack of criminal responsibility. And that's why the defense experts are going to matter so much. So, week 3, Reddington has been laying pieces of the puzzle all over the table, and now he has to bring in somebody that's qualified to tell the jury, here's how all those pieces fit together. And that's where this trial is going to be won or lost. So I'll be bringing you the wrap up on week 4 in the next episode. But in the meantime, have a great week, and you may step off the witness stand. I'm Beverly, and I'm on the witness stand.